In a small town tucked between fading hills and roads that cracked from years of neglect, there lived a young man named Daniel Carter. He was only 18, but life had carved lines of responsibility into his face far too early. His father had died when Daniel was still a child, and his mother, the strongest person he had ever known, had passed away just last year after a long illness. Losing her left Daniel with nothing but a few worn-out clothes, memories that sometimes hurt more than they comforted, and her rusty old bicycle. That bicycle was more than a possession. It was his lifeline. Every dent in the frame, every squeak of the chain carried stories of his mother pedaling him to school or racing with him through the streets when life was still simple. Now it was the only thing keeping him alive. Every morning Daniel climbed onto it to deliver groceries, parcels, and medicine around town. He worked until his legs ached, because each delivery meant a few coins, just enough to keep a roof over his head. His rented room above a noisy bar was no palace, but it was shelter. Missing even one delivery meant risking eviction, and the landlord had already warned him. No rent, no key. Life for Daniel was a cycle of survival. He woke before dawn, pulling on the same faded hoodie and sneakers that barely held together. His hands were always rough from the cold and from gripping the handlebars too tight. By evening, his shoulders ached and his back begged for rest. And yet, he never stopped. He couldn't, because in his world, slowing down meant going hungry. Still, Daniel hadn't let hardship turn his heart bitter. That was the most remarkable thing about him. He still managed to smile at children playing in the street, even when his own stomach growled with hunger. He still held doors open for strangers, even when his arms were weighed down with deliveries. And sometimes, when he finished work early enough, he would pause at the park just to watch the sunset paint the sky. Those rare, quiet moments reminded him that not everything in this world was cruel. On this particular evening, winter pressed down harder than ever. The air was sharp, cutting into his skin no matter how tightly he zipped his jacket. His delivery bag, fraying at the seams, felt heavier than usual. Daniel had one last delivery to make before the clock struck 8. Just one. If he succeeded, he would have just enough money to pay his rent for the week. If not, he already knew what awaited him: a locked door and his belongings thrown out like garbage. As he pushed forward, the wheels of the bike rattling over broken pavement, Daniel's breath came out in clouds of white mist. His stomach growled, reminding him that his last meal had been hours ago, but he ignored it. Hunger had become a familiar companion. What mattered now was the ticking clock. Time was always against him, and tonight was no different. And yet, even with the weight of survival pressing against his shoulders, a small part of Daniel refused to give up hope. Somewhere deep inside, he believed life couldn't always be this cruel. Maybe, just maybe, something would change. Maybe all the pain had a purpose. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that his life was about to shift forever. And it would begin with a single, unexpected choice he was about to make on this cold winter night. Daniel pedaled faster, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The street lamps flickered weakly, their yellow light stretching across cracked sidewalks and empty storefronts. Most people were already home, warm behind closed doors, their dinners steaming on kitchen tables. Daniel envied them, though he would never admit it aloud. For him, the night meant another race against time. Just one last delivery, and he'd be safe for now. But as he passed an old bus stop near the edge of town, something caught his attention. At first, he tried to ignore it. Time was short, his legs were tired. The landlord's warning echoed in his head. Still, something inside him forced his eyes back. There, under the dim light of a leaning street lamp, stood an elderly woman. She wore a beige wool coat that had clearly seen better decades. Her silver hair stuck out from beneath a faded scarf, and her thin hands clutched a worn leather purse. What unsettled Daniel wasn't just her appearance, it was the way she stood. Not like someone waiting for a bus, but like someone lost. She glanced at every passing car with hope that quickly dissolved into confusion. Her lips moved, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. Daniel slowed down, his bike squeaking in protest. He told himself he didn't have time. One late delivering, and I'm out on the street. But then the wind shifted, carrying her faint, trembling voice toward him. Bus 12, Willow Lane, or was it Garden? The words tumbled out, broken and uncertain, like leaves scattered in the wind. Something heavy pressed on Daniel's chest. He looked at the clock on his phone. 7:42. Barely enough time to reach his destination if he kept riding. If he stopped, if he even paused for a moment, he'd lose everything. His rent, his tiny bed, his one fragile thread of stability. But as he looked at the old woman, shuffling her feet back and forth, taking hesitant steps toward the curb only to retreat again, Daniel felt his heart tighten. She reminded him of his mother in her final days, lost, fragile, and clinging to whatever strength she had left. He couldn't just ride past. Not tonight, not ever. With a sigh that turned into a visible puff of breath, Daniel steered his bike toward the bus stop. The tires crunched against gravel, and he stopped a few feet away, careful not to frighten her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady but gentle. "Are you all right?" The woman blinked at him, as if his face were part of a distant memory. Her eyes, clouded with age, darted between him and the empty road. "I was trying to get home," she murmured. "But I think I missed the bus. Or maybe it missed me." Her laugh was small and brittle, fragile like glass that might crack at the slightest touch. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He nodded slowly, speaking with the same patience his mother once used with him. "Where do you live? Maybe I can help you get there." The woman fumbled with her purse, pulling out random objects: an old lipstick, a bus ticket from 2 days ago, a handful of coins, even a button, but no address, no directions, nothing that could guide her home. Daniel's chest ached as he watched, her struggle, her confusion deepening with every second. Then he noticed something, a delicate silver chain around her neck. At the end of it was a small oval pendant. Leaning closer, Daniel saw words engraved in elegant cursive: Evelyn Rose, 48 Oak Hill Drive, Northside. He froze. Oak Hill, he knew that place. It was nearly 2 hours away by bike, most of it uphill. If he took her there, he would miss his delivery. He would lose his room. He would be homeless tonight. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the cold wind biting at his skin. He looked into her eyes, again soft, trusting, and helpless. And in that instant, Daniel understood something. Some choices mattered more than survival. He took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "That's a bit far, but I think we can make it," he said. He adjusted his bike, tied his scarf around the back seat, and helped Evelyn sit carefully. Then he slipped off his jacket and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "Hold on tight," Daniel whispered, and with that, he began to pedal into the night, unaware that this single decision would change his life forever. The night grew colder as Daniel pedaled away from the bus stop, the weight of his decision pressing down on him even harder than the icy wind. Each turn of the pedals was a gamble. He knew exactly what he had just sacrificed. The delivery bag across his chest suddenly felt heavier, not because of the parcels inside, but because of what they represented: rent, food, shelter. The one fragile thread keeping him off the streets. By choosing to help Evelyn, he had let that thread slip from his hands. Still, as he glanced over his shoulder, seeing her small figure bundled in his jacket, clutching his scarf like it was her only anchor, he knew there had never really been a choice. Not for him. He could endure hunger. He could endure cold. He had done it before. But he couldn't endure the thought of leaving someone helpless behind. The road stretched ahead, winding out of town. Streetlights thinned until they vanished completely, leaving only the pale glow of the moon. The bicycle rattled with every bump, its old frame protesting with squeaks and groans. "I'm sorry if it's uncomfortable," Daniel said, breathless but trying to keep his tone light. "This old bike isn't exactly built for luxury." Evelyn chuckled softly, though her voice was distant. "You remind me of my grandson. He used to ride a bike like this, always scratched his knees, always too stubborn to slow down." Her words trailed off, and for a moment Daniel thought she had fallen asleep. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "He's gone now." Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Loss was something he understood all too well. Instead, he just nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "Hold on, ma'am. We'll get you home." The uphill climb was brutal. Every muscle in his legs screamed. His hands, stiff from the cold, gripped the handlebars until his knuckles ached. The icy wind whipped against his face, cutting through his skin like shards of glass. He could feel the clock ticking. In his mind, every passing minute sealing his fate with the landlord, but he pushed it aside. Survival had taken a back seat. Compassion was in control now. At one point, he stopped at a small gas station, his breath ragged, his body trembling from exhaustion. He counted the coins in his pocket, just enough for one steaming cup of tea. He carried it outside, pressing it gently into Evelyn's hands. "Here, this will help warm you." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. Then, to his surprise, she pushed the cup back toward him. "You drink first," she insisted, her voice firm despite its frailty. "You need it more than I do." The gesture caught Daniel off guard. For a second, he saw his mother's face in hers, the same stern kindness, the same unwillingness to let him go without. He took a sip, the warmth sliding down his throat like hope itself, then handed it back with a grateful smile. The road grew darker still, fields sleeping under frost, stretching endlessly on either side. Bridges groaned under the bike's weight as they crossed, their wooden planks echoing with every push of the pedals. And yet, despite the brutal cold, despite the exhaustion that made his body feel like stone, Daniel kept moving. Because Evelyn wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a reminder that kindness mattered more than survival, that humanity was worth the sacrifice. By the time they reached the outskirts of Oak Hill, Daniel's legs felt like they might give out at any moment. His breath came in shallow gasps, his vision blurred with fatigue. But when Evelyn stirred behind him, whispering, "Are we there yet?" in that fragile, hopeful tone, he forced himself to sit straighter, to push harder. "Almost," he said, his voice steady even as his body trembled. "We're almost there." And deep down, he prayed that the choice he had made tonight, this selfless choice, would not leave him with nothing but the cold. The climb to Oak Hill was nothing short of brutal. Each stretch of road seemed steeper than the last, as though the very earth itself wanted to test Daniel's resolve. His bike creaked under the weight of two bodies, its old chain rattling like it might snap at any moment. His lungs burned, each breath a desperate gulp of freezing night air. His legs felt like they were carrying bricks instead of flesh. But still, he pushed forward. Behind him, Evelyn shifted gently, humming a tune that rose and fell like fragments of a forgotten lullaby. Sometimes she would pause mid-verse, her voice trailing off into silence, and then she'd ask softly, "Where are we now?" Daniel always answered as if it were the first time she had asked, "We're closer, just over the next hill." And though the hills never seemed to end, he kept his promise by moving forward. The cold was merciless. It crawled through his thin hoodie, sinking deep into his bones. His hands trembled as they gripped the handlebars, knuckles raw and stiff. Yet whenever the bike wobbled on the uneven pavement, he steadied it, making sure Evelyn never felt the jolt. She had trusted him, a stranger, to guide her home. He couldn't betray that trust. At one point, they passed a frozen field where the moonlight glistened off the frost like scattered diamonds. Evelyn lifted her head, her cloudy eyes widening. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost like a child seeing snow for the first time. Daniel glanced sideways, the sight of her wonder somehow warming him more than the tea had. "Yeah," he said softly, "it is." For a moment, he forgot about the clock, the rent, the landlord. For a moment, it was just two souls sharing, a fragile sliver of peace. But reality pressed back quickly. His stomach growled loudly, a reminder that he had skipped meals to stretch his money for rent. Evelyn heard it and touched his shoulder with surprising strength. "You haven't eaten," she said, her tone carrying more certainty than question. Daniel forced a smile. "I'll be fine. I always am." He didn't want to burden her with his struggle, but inside, he knew he was running on fumes. Halfway up the longest hill, his legs nearly gave out. He stopped, leaning against the handlebars, chest heaving. Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to. I'll be fine waiting until morning." Daniel shook his head quickly, his breath coming out in short, white clouds. "No, you need to be home tonight." He glanced back at her, his eyes fierce with determination. "You trusted me, and I won't let you down." Then, with a groan of effort, he pushed the pedals again, dragging them both higher into the night. They stopped once more at a roadside bench near a flickering lamppost. Daniel bought another cup of hot tea with the last crumpled dollar in his pocket. Evelyn tried to protest, but he insisted. "Please, just drink it, you'll feel better." She took a sip, then handed it back to him, just like before. "Share it," she said firmly. No one should drink alone. The bond between them grew stronger with each mile. It wasn't just about getting her home anymore, it was about connection. She filled the silence with small stories of her past, fragments of memory. A garden she once tended, a grandson who loved to play the piano, a husband whose laughter had filled their home. Sometimes her words tangled together, slipping into confusion, but Daniel listened to every one as if they were treasures. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey, the tall gates of Oak Hill appeared in the distance, white paint-chipped iron bars wrapped in ivy, standing like a doorway between worlds. Daniel's legs shook violently as he coasted to a stop. He had nothing left in him. His lungs ached, his fingers were numb, but a wave of relief washed over him. Evelyn looked up at the familiar sight, tears glistening in her tired eyes. "Home," she whispered, her hand pressed against Daniel's shoulder, trembling but grateful. "You brought me home." And though Daniel could hardly stand, his chest swelled with something far stronger than exhaustion pride. He had kept his word. He had made the impossible journey. He had chosen compassion over survival. And for the first time in months, he felt like his mother would have been proud. The iron gates of 48 Oak Hill Drive loomed before them, tall and weathered, their white paint peeling in thin flakes that fluttered in the cold air. For Daniel, it felt like reaching the finish line of a marathon he hadn't trained for. His legs trembled so badly he thought they might give out before he could even roll the last few feet. But when he saw Evelyn's eyes light up with recognition, something inside him pushed the pain aside. He stopped the bike carefully at the gate, his chest heaving, every breath a cloud of white in the freezing night. He slid off the seat and steadied the bike as Evelyn slowly climbed down, her small frame shaking not only from the cold but also from the emotion of finally being home. "We made it," Daniel whispered, though his voice was more breath than sound. Evelyn reached out, brushing her fingers along the rusted bars like someone touching a memory. "Yes," she breathed, her lips trembling into a faint smile. "Home." Daniel leaned the bike against the fence and rang the bell once. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, his numb fingers gripping the handle like it was his last bit of strength. Finally, the porch light flicked on. Moments later, the door opened, and an elderly man stepped out, wearing a robe and slippers. His expression was weary until he saw Evelyn, Miss Rose. He gasped, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Oh, my lord, where have you been?" He rushed forward, nearly tripping over the uneven steps, his eyes wide with relief and panic. "All at once, we've been calling the hospitals, the police." We thought his voice broke before he could finish. Evelyn blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her face before softening into calm. "I went for a walk," she said simply. Then, glancing at Daniel, she added with a gentle laugh, "or maybe a ride." The man turned his gaze toward Daniel, his face collapsing into gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." He tried to usher Daniel inside. "Please, come in, warm yourself, eat something. At least let us drive you home." For a moment, the idea tempted Daniel more than he wanted to admit. His body screamed for warmth, for food, for rest. The glow from the open doorway was like an invitation to another world, a world he didn't belong to, a world of safety, comfort, and belonging. But then reality returned. He thought of the landlord's warning. He thought of his belongings, stuffed in a bag, waiting to be thrown into the cold. He couldn't afford to stay. He couldn't risk falling into comfort he knew wasn't his to claim. So he shook his head gently. "No need," he said softly. His voice was tired, but steady. "I should get back before it gets colder." The man frowned, clearly unsettled by the refusal. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket, fumbling for something to give him, but Daniel stopped her. Instead, he pulled a crumpled receipt from his delivery bag, scribbled his name and number with a shaky pen, and handed it to her. "In case you ever need help again," he said simply. Evelyn clutched the slip of paper in her thin hands, as though it were more valuable than gold. Her eyes glistened as she looked at him. "You remind me of someone I love," she whispered. Daniel didn't know what to say. He only managed a small nod before climbing back onto his bike. His legs screamed in protest, but he pedaled away into the darkness, leaving the glow of the house behind. He didn't realize it then, but while he was losing everything he thought mattered, his rent, his shelter, his small, fragile security, he was also gaining something far greater, something invisible, but powerful, a connection, a beginning. Because sometimes, the greatest stories don't start with what you win, they start with what you're willing to risk. The ride back into town was colder, lonelier, and heavier than the journey out to Oak Hill, without Evelyn's soft humming behind him, without her fragile weight leaning trustingly on his bike. Daniel felt the night press down on him harder than ever. The road seemed longer, the air sharper, Every bump rattled through his bones, every gust of wind cut deeper. He was exhausted, but he refused to stop. He needed to reach his boarding house before the cold swallowed him completely. By the time he coasted onto his street, it was well past 9. The town was nearly silent. Storefronts were dark, their signs flickering faintly. Only a few windows glowed faintly with life. Daniel's body trembled from head to toe as he climbed the porch steps of the rundown two-story where he rented his room. The light above the door hadn't worked in months, but he didn't need it. He knew the place by heart. Reaching into his pocket, he searched for his key. His fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled through every seam of his jacket. Then his jeans. Nothing. Panic sparked. He checked again, digging deeper, patting every corner of fabric until the truth became undeniable. The key was gone. At first, he thought maybe he'd dropped it during the climb up Oak Hill, or maybe back at the gas station when he bought Evelyn tea. Wherever it wasn't here. His heart sank as he grabbed the doorknob, twisting it desperately. Locked. He knocked softly, hoping the landlord was still awake. No answer. He knocked harder, louder, still silence. Then, as if to make the truth sting even more, his eyes fell to the ground. There, sitting on the porch, was a plastic grocery bag stuffed with his belongings, a spare shirt, a towel, his cracked phone charger. On top of it, taped to the door, was a note scrawled in thick black marker. Past due, locks changed. The words hit him harder than the winter air. For a long moment, he just stood there, the bike at his side, his breath fogging in the dark. He felt his chest tighten, torn between the urge to scream and the temptation to collapse. But he did neither. Instead, he simply lowered his head and closed his eyes. Daniel knew this was the cost of his choice. He had saved Evelyn, but in doing so, he had lost the only shelter he had left. His small room was now just another locked door in a world full of them. With nowhere to go, he climbed back on his bike and pedaled slowly toward the center of town. The streets blurred together, empty alleys, shuttered shops, dim lampposts casting long shadows. He kept moving, not because he had a destination, but because stopping meant freezing, and tonight, stillness could be dangerous. Around midnight, his bike rolled past the back alley of Johnson's Market, a small grocery store where he sometimes helped restock shelves in exchange for day-old bread and a few dollars. The owner, Mr. Johnson, was known for being gruff but fair. He had a way of seeing struggle without asking questions. Desperate, Daniel knocked gently on the side door. For a moment, he thought no one would answer. Then a faint light flickered inside, and the door creaked open. Mr. Johnson stood there, wearing a heavy robe and holding a steaming mug. His eyes landed on Daniel, shivering, hollow-eyed, clutching his bike like a lifeline, and he let out a tired sigh. Didn't make rent. Huh, the old man muttered. Daniel shook his head silently. His pride wanted him to explain, to justify, to say that he had done the right thing, even if it had cost him everything. But the words stuck in his throat. Mr. Johnson didn't push. He simply looked up at the night sky, as though waiting for some higher authority to intervene. Then, with a reluctant nod, he stepped aside. Storeroom's dry. There's a cot in the corner. Don't touch the wine crates, and don't freeze to death on me. Daniel's lips parted in relief. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. He wheeled his bike inside and stepped into the storeroom. It smelled of cardboard, citrus, and faint traces of coffee. The radiator in the corner groaned with age, but radiated just enough warmth to thaw the edge of the cold. He collapsed onto the thin cot, pulling the blanket tightly around his shoulders. His body ached. His chest felt heavy. Yet, strangely, his heart was quiet. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid to close his eyes. He thought of Evelyn's hand on his shoulder, her laughter drifting into the night, the way she had looked at him like he wasn't invisible. And as he drifted into sleep, he realized something profound. Even though the world had taken his room, it hadn't taken his humanity. He had chosen kindness over survival, and somehow, in the silence of that storeroom, he felt that choice would matter more than he yet understood. Morning arrived slowly, the kind of grey dawn that made the world feel half asleep. A thin light filtered through the small frosted window of Johnson's Market storeroom, falling across Daniel's tired face. His body ached from the hard cot. His legs still sore from the endless climb to Oak Hill, but he rose quietly, folding the blanket with care before setting it neatly against the wall. Survival had taught him to respect even the smallest kindness. In the front of the shop, Mr. Johnson was already at work, as he always was, grumbling as he arranged crates of fruit by the window. Without a word, he slid a banana and a hot cup of coffee toward Daniel. It wasn't much, but it was more than Daniel expected. "Eat," the old man muttered. Daniel peeled the banana slowly, whispering, "Thank you," as he sipped the bitter coffee. The warmth spread through him like life returning to his bones. From the window, Daniel watched the town begin its day. Children shuffled along sidewalks, with backpacks, steam rose from car hoods, and shopkeepers pulled open squeaky shutters. To everyone else, it was just another morning. For Daniel, it was the fragile start of another day. He wasn't sure how to survive. He told himself he would find another delivery job, maybe convince the landlord to give him one more chance. But deep down, he knew the thread holding his life together had already snapped. Then it happened. A car pulled up to the curb outside Johnson's Market. Not just any car, a sleek black sedan, polished so clean it seemed out of place on these cracked streets. It glided to a stop, too quiet, too perfect. Daniel froze, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. A tall man stepped out, his coat too fine for a town like this, his shoes unscuffed, his posture sharp. He held a small slip of paper in his hand and looked around until his eyes landed on the shop window. On Daniel, it felt as though the man had known exactly where to find him all along. The bell above the market door jingled as he stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink around him, his presence too polished for the dusty aisles. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I'm looking for someone named Daniel Carter." Daniel's chest tightened. For a second, he considered lying, pretending he wasn't the one. But something in the man's steady gaze left no room for denial. "That's me," Daniel said cautiously, his voice low. Relief flickered across the stranger's face. "Good. My name is Charles. Miss Evelyn Rose sent me." He glanced down at the paper in his hand, the crumpled receipt. Daniel had scribbled his number on the night before. "She asked me to find you. She remembers everything, and she insists on thanking you personally." Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had left Evelyn at her gate, thinking that was the end, that his part in her story was finished. He never expected that slip of paper would lead anyone back to him. Behind the counter, Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. He didn't say a word, but his silence was heavy with curiosity. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't need thanks," he said. "I just wanted to make sure she got home safe." His words were honest, but his tone carried the exhaustion of someone who couldn't imagine what a woman like Evelyn could truly want from someone like him. Charles studied him for a moment, neither offended nor dismissive. "She told me you gave her more than directions," he said. "She said you gave her back something she thought she had lost, a sense of herself. She wants to tell you that in person." Daniel's stomach tightened. The thought of stepping into Evelyn's world, a world of wealth, power, and safety, felt like stepping barefoot onto marble floors where he didn't belong. He was a boy with a second-hand bike and nowhere to sleep. What business did he have in a house like hers? Sensing his hesitation, Charles softened his tone. "She was very clear, Daniel. She wants to see you." Daniel glanced at Mr. Johnson, silently asking for guidance. The old man shrugged, hiding concern behind indifference. "Go," he muttered. "Your cot will be here if you need it." For a long moment, Daniel hesitated, torn between fear and something else he couldn't quite name. Then, finally, he nodded. Taking a deep breath, he followed Charles out the door and toward the waiting car, unaware that he was about to step into a world that would change everything. The drive back to Oak Hill felt surreal in daylight. The road that had seemed endless and punishing the night before now stretched calmly before Daniel's eyes. The frost-covered fields shimmered under the pale sun, and the hills he had climbed, with every ounce of his strength, looked softer, almost forgiving. But Daniel remembered each stone, each incline, etched deep into his aching muscles. This time, though he sat in the back of a quiet, luxurious car, the leather seats far too soft for someone used to sleeping on a cot. Charles drove without saying much, giving Daniel space to wrestle with his thoughts. His fingers fidgeted nervously on his lap as the mansion came into view, standing proud against the skyline. In daylight, it looked even larger, its white walls glowing, ivy climbing elegantly across the facade. It wasn't just a house, it was a world Daniel had never belonged to. As they pulled through the tall gates, Daniel's chest tightened. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding harder with every passing second. He wanted to tell Charles to turn back, to let him out before he embarrassed himself. But before he could speak, the car rolled to a stop in front of the grand entrance. Inside, Charles led him through a side hallway into a sunlit room filled with bookshelves, the air carrying the faint scent of old pages and lavender. A large window overlooked a winter garden, and sitting by it, wrapped in a light shawl, was Evelyn Rose. This was not the fragile, wandering woman Daniel had peddled through the night with. Her posture was upright, her hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp and clear. But when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, her face broke into a smile so genuine it felt like the morning sun breaking through clouds. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling, not from weakness but from truth. She reached out her hands, her eyes glistening. "You brought me home." Daniel froze, unsure of what to do. Slowly, he stepped forward and took her hands in his. Her grip was gentle but insistent, as if she feared he might vanish if she didn't hold on. "I remember everything," Evelyn said softly. "Every word, every street. You didn't treat me like a burden. You didn't look away. You made me feel safe." Her eyes shimmered with tears that she didn't bother to hide. "Do you know how long it's been since I felt safe?" Daniel lowered his head, embarrassed. "That's kind of you," he murmured. "But I didn't do it to get anything. I just wanted to make sure you got home." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet vulnerability underneath. The confession of someone who had nothing to give but kindness. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Her eyes didn't waver, didn't judge. Instead, they softened, filling with something Daniel hadn't expected: respect. "And that," she whispered, "is exactly why I want you to stay." The words struck him like a thunderclap. "Stay." He blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. His instinct was to pull back, to retreat into the comfort of anonymity. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to belong in this place of chandeliers, warmth, and safety. He was just a delivery boy, with no home, no family, no finish line. He opened his mouth to protest, but Evelyn silenced him with a gentle squeeze of his hand. "You gave me back something no money can buy," she said. "Hope. I want you here, Daniel, not because I pity you, but because you remind me that humanity still exists. You reminded me of my grandson, and I don't want to lose that again." Daniel's heart raced, caught between disbelief and an ache he couldn't name. For so long, the world had looked past him, treating him as invisible, as disposable. Yet, here was Evelyn Rosa, woman of immense wealth and power, looking directly into his eyes and telling him he mattered. The silence between them stretched, soft but uncertain. Daniel finally pulled back, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I belong here." Evelyn smiled, her gaze unwavering. "Then let us make a place for you." And in that moment, something shifted. The boy who had nothing but a rusty bicycle and an empty stomach suddenly found himself standing at the threshold of a new life, a life that he had never dared to imagine. Daniel sat across from Evelyn in that sunlit room, his hands resting nervously on his knees. He felt like an intruder, as though any second someone would walk in and remind him he didn't belong here. The shelves filled with leather-bound books, the grand window overlooking the garden, even the polished wood floor beneath his worn shoes, they all whispered of a world he had only ever seen from a distance. But Evelyn's eyes kept him steady. They weren't the clouded, lost eyes from the night before. They were sharp, filled with life and purpose. She studied him not with pity, but with a kind of recognition, as if she saw past the ragged hoodie and tired frame to something he himself had forgotten. "You remind me of my grandson," she said softly, her voice thick with memory. "The way you listened more than you spoke. The way you gave without expecting anything back. He was like that too." Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze didn't. "When you helped me that night, you woke something in me that had been asleep for years. And I will not let that gift go unanswered." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He wanted to tell her he didn't need anything, that he was fine, that her gratitude was enough. But the truth pressed against his chest like a weight. He wasn't fine. He was barely surviving. He had no home, no plan, no future. All he had was a bike, and the will to keep moving. As though reading his thoughts, Evelyn leaned forward. "Tell me, Daniel, do you want to return to school?" The question hit him like a shock. School. The words stirred memories of classrooms he had left behind too soon. Books gathering dust in a corner he never had the chance to finish. He thought of his mother, who used to tell him, "Education is the one thing no one can take from you." He had believed her, but after she passed, survival had taken priority over dreams. Daniel hesitated, his fingers curling against his jeans. I don't know if that's possible," he admitted. "I can't even pay for a room, let alone tuition." Evelyn's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then let me make it possible." He looked up sharply, his eyes wide. "I don't want charity," he said quickly, his pride flaring. For so long, he had survived on his own. Accepting help felt dangerous, like admitting weakness. But Evelyn shook her head, gently. "This isn't charity. This is recognition. You gave me back something priceless, my sense of dignity, my safety, my hope. Now it's my turn to give you back what you should never have lost, a chance." Her words pierced through the walls he had built around himself. For a long moment, he sat in silence, staring down at his hands. He thought of the nights spent hungry, of the cold floors he had curled up on, of the locked door with the cruel note taped to it. Then he thought of what could be: books, classrooms, learning, the chance to dream again. When he finally lifted his head, there was a new steadiness in his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, his voice carrying both fear and determination. "I'd like that. I'd like to go back to school." Evelyn's smile deepened, her eyes glistening. Then it settled. From that day forward, things began to change. Charles arranged the details quietly, without spectacle. Within weeks, Evelyn created a scholarship fund in Daniel's name, something official, something permanent. It wasn't splashed across newspapers or flaunted at parties. It was quiet, intentional, just like her gratitude. Daniel found himself with books in his hands again, his evenings filled with studying, instead of endless deliveries. But more than that, he found himself with a place: morning walks with Evelyn through her greenhouse, afternoons of conversation over tea, weekends filled with talks about the future. She didn't treat him as a project, she treated him as family. And though he still carried the scars of hunger, loneliness, and struggle, he also carried something new: opportunity. A seed planted in the coldest winter of his life, now beginning to grow. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he was living. Months passed, and Daniel's life began to take on a rhythm he had never known before. For the first time in years, he wasn't living from moment to moment, hand to mouth, hoping each day wouldn't collapse beneath him. Instead, he woke up with purpose. He attended classes, scribbling notes eagerly, as if trying to catch up on everything life had stolen from him. His hands, once calloused from endless deliveries, now turned pages in books that opened new worlds. And through it all, Evelyn remained by his side, not as a benefactor flaunting her wealth, but as a companion. Their days were filled with quiet rituals: morning walks through her greenhouse, afternoons spent sipping tea while she asked him about his studies, evenings where they shared stories of her past and his dreams for the future. She gave him stability, yes, but more than that, she gave him belonging. Daniel still rode his old bicycle from time to time. He didn't need it anymore. Charles often insisted on driving him, but he chose to keep it. The bike was a reminder. Every squeak of its chain, every rattle of its wheels told the story of where he had come from. Sometimes, when the world felt too polished, too new, he pedaled into town, retracing the roads he once rode in desperation. He would pass the cracked sidewalks, the shuttered shops, the bus stop where everything had changed. And whenever he reached that lonely bench under the leaning street lamp, he slowed down, tipped his head toward the sky, and smiled, because that place wasn't just a bus stop anymore. It was the moment his life had turned. It was the place where he had chosen compassion over convenience, where he had risked everything for someone he didn't know, where kindness had rewritten his story. One evening, after a long day of studying, Daniel sat with Evelyn by the window of her library. The sky outside burned orange as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with fire. Evelyn's voice was quiet but steady as she spoke. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Stopping for me that night, when it cost you so much?" Daniel thought of the locked door, the note taped in black marker, the cold walk back into town with nowhere to go. He thought of the hunger, the exhaustion, the ache of loss that had nearly broken him. And then he thought of her hand on his shoulder, her laughter under the moonlight, the warmth of her presence in his life now. He shook his head slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "No," he said firmly. "I don't regret it, because that night gave me everything I have now." Evelyn's eyes softened. She reached over, resting her frail hand on his end. "You gave me back more than you'll ever know." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of gratitude, of unspoken understanding, of two lives forever intertwined by one act of kindness. Years later, when people asked Daniel how his story had changed, he would never speak of scholarships or grand houses or second chances. He would speak of that night, of the cold wind, the broken bike, and the trembling voice that called out for help. He would tell them that sometimes home doesn't come from a place, but from a moment, and that sometimes all it takes to change the course of a life is the willingness to stop, to listen, and to care, because kindness had saved him. And he had learned, through Evelyn Rose, that kindness has the power not just to change a night, but to change everything.